So the first theme is calmness. Many of you heard the distinction that's sometimes made between Samatha and Vipassana, calm and insight. And it's tricky with these things. One thing perhaps to say before we start is a lot of terms that are used in the Buddhist tradition, in the teaching, they refer to the practice and they refer to the fruit of the practice. So for example, mindfulness, there are practices of mindfulness, but mindfulness is also a quality that we cultivate. Calm is a way of practicing, but it's a quality we cultivate. People talk about doing Vipassana, but actually insight is a quality we cultivate. So it can be a little bit confusing. So just, bear that in mind, that all these things refer to both a practice and the outcome of practice, which is what we're cultivating. The ancient Pali word for meditation, bhavana, means to cultivate, means bringing into being. And samatha, or calm, tranquility, is really a way of practicing, and the fruit of those practices that focuses on stilling the body, calming the mind, gathering our attention. Composure, I think, is quite a nice way of putting it, because we're not going to see clearly if our mind is buzzing and busy and all over the place. So it is kind of foundational, but it's also useful in itself. The Buddha had lots of metaphors for meditation, and one of the metaphors for this quality is, he described a post with 6 wild animals tethered to it. It's just a metaphor. It might not be very good for the animals, but so there's a crocodile and a bird, and I think a wild boar and various things, and they represent the 6 senses, the 5 physical senses and the mind. So at first they're all trying to escape and go back to their own domain, the forest or the sky or the sea. But gradually they realize they're not going anywhere, and they become docile and settle down. So that metaphor may or may not work for you, but it's kind of what happens to our senses with practice. Eventually they settle down. Now that may not happen in a particular sitting. It may not happen in a particular day. This is an ongoing practice. So I'd also caution against measuring our practice against how much we cultivate these qualities. But there are ways of practicing that really support calming the body and mind. So when we come to sit, you might want to think particularly this first sitting of the day. We've arrived from whatever we've arrived from, but probably busy lives. So there are some ways of really encouraging tranquility. So one is physically just to really bring the attention downwards, to feel the body, to feel the contact with the ground. Just have that sense of the attention not just being up here, but throughout the body. Sometimes just slightly slower out breaths, slightly longer out breaths. Making sure we're breathing from the belly, what they call diaphragmatic breathing. So if when we breathe, you can check this by having a hand on your belly and a hand on your chest. If most of the breath is up here, most of the movement is up in the chest, that can mean that we're slightly hyperventilating, taking in too much oxygen. Now, if you're running for a bus, that's really useful. But if we're sitting calmly, just help very lightly, very, very lightly, without making anything wrong about our breathing. Our body knows how to breathe, but just having a sense of, is the belly moving as well as we breathe? Is the breath moving down the body? And all these things activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is just that part of the autonomic nervous system, which is more, the sympathetic nervous system is about activity, and it's partly often associated with the fight-flight response, but it's really just what gets us out of bed in the morning as well. We need it, it's important, but we also need to give time for what the parasympathetic nervous system is often called rest and digest. So I think that just says it all, resting and digesting our food, but also digesting what is happening in our lives, those times which perhaps in our modern world, we sometimes don't give enough time for. Sorry, let me turn off that app that just beeped. You know, we're often told in meditation and in mindfulness practice not to manipulate our experience. And generally that is good advice. So I don't want to contradict that, but I think it's also quite important and helpful at the very beginning of a sitting, beginning of the day, the beginning of practice, to give some time to, you know, just allowing the body mind to calm. Especially if we're a little bit agitated, actually consciously bringing the attention down, breathing a bit more deeply, can support us at the beginning of practice, and then we can let it all return, you know, to its normal rhythm. So we're not forcing anything. I think that's really important. We're not forcing the mind onto the body or onto the breath. Ajahn Sucitto says that if we just gradually disconnect from thoughts, I have this image when he says it of one of those old-fashioned switchboards, we just gradually disconnect from the trains of thought, then the natural home of the mind or the body, or the natural home of the heart and the mind, the citta, is in the body. It's quite natural that when we pull back a little bit from the busyness of the mind, the attention rests in the body. And awareness of the breath particularly takes us into the body, but it might be that for you the breath isn't the most helpful anchor. It might just be the body, the contact with the ground, contact with one hand on the other hand. So as I say, we're not forcing anything. This is much more about non-doing than about doing. So as I said, these words like calm or tranquility, they refer to the fruit of practice, but we need to be careful not to grasp after that. That may not be the fruit right now. The practice doesn't lead to that immediately. But if there is just a little more calmness, just really allowing ourselves to appreciate that, to enjoy that as well. Samatha practice, calming practice, can really support very deep ease, relaxation, where we make less demands on the world because there's more of a sense of peace of mind can come from within. We're less craving for external pleasures, excitement, etc. And it clears away the surface chatter, the distraction that stops us from seeing clearly. The traditionally called the hindrances, which is just a kind of categorization of all the different things that can interfere with calming the mind. You're probably very familiar with these. And they're often compared to a pond. So the mind is like a pond, which if it's really clear, we can see right to the bottom. But what happens is we have thoughts or feelings of desire, and that's like bright colors on the surface of the pond. We can't see the bottom. Or we get caught up in thoughts and feelings of aversion or ill will, and that's like the water is boiling. We can't see to the bottom. Sometimes we're very restless, a little anxious, worried about something, and that's like the surface of the water being whipped up by wind. And sometimes we're very tired. Life, you know, can be quite demanding, and maybe when we stop, what happens is, we just feel very drowsy, sluggish. And that's like stagnant water with algae. We can't see through it. And it can be quite subtle, these restlessness and tiredness. Or the final one is doubt, which is not healthy questioning, but a kind of corrosive questioning of what am I doing? What else could I have been doing today? What am I doing here? Which is like muddy water. So in the initial, when we sit down, we can notice some of these in our practice, and those metaphors may or may not, you know, describe what it feels like for you. But like with a pond, it will take a little while for the water to become clear, for the mind to become, more clear, more malleable, the attention to steady. And this is said in the tradition to prepare the mind for insight. The mind becomes clearer, more malleable, more refined, so then we can see more clearly. But I think it's important to say that this isn't just a kind of foundation or beginning practice, that this composure that is developed is, sometimes we call it concentration, but I don't know about you, the word concentration gives me a headache. I just think, no, concentration is a bit too forced, but there's a kind of focus and a gathering and a composure, which is cultivated by these calming practices, and it's worth exploring for its own sake. It really, you know, the calm insight distinction is not really as clear cut. It's not as clear cut in the early texts as the tradition maybe has sometimes made it. So any degree of composure, of collectedness, this level of calm, this unification of the mind and body, it supports a very deep sense of well-being, of nourishment, which, you know, in the face of the challenges of our lives and the challenges of the world, which feel particularly intense at the moment, it's really important that we can nourish resilience, that we can rest, that we can have that sense of inner well-being. So practices to support this in meditation, as well as that initial grounding of the body, bringing down the breath, is generally the practice is to have an anchor for our attention and to keep coming back to it. So there's a sense of a level of focus. So I'll say more about that when we sit, but basically this is the initial meditation practice that probably all of you have learned. But the idea is that we choose our anchor. And as I said, for most people, most of the time, the breath is a very good anchor. It's the sensations of breathing. I mean, in a way, it's not the breath itself. The breath is something physiological that's happening, but we can feel the sensations of breathing in the chest, in the belly, wherever in the body. And it's a dynamic, flowing process. So it's got a bit of a hook for our attention. It's more interesting, perhaps, than something that isn't moving and changing. It's also very salient to us. We have to breathe to live. The breath is what is connecting us with the world around us and keeping us alive. So it's used in most meditation traditions as an anchor, as a place to rest the attention. If for any reason, if you have a physical issue with the breath, or if you have any history of panic attacks, breathing that seems to drive anxiety, then, check in with yourself, and it might be easier to focus the attention somewhere else. It's really important that our anchor is somewhere that feels safe and comfortable. So don't force yourself to watch the breath if the breath doesn't feel safe and comfortable. It might be something further down the body. It might just be the rising and falling of the abdomen, which is the breath in a way, but in another way it isn't. It's just a body movement. The breath is up here. So it's just the movement of the inner organs with the diaphragm. Or just if you're resting one hand on another, that can be your focus. Obviously, in some traditions, the focus for calming practice might be a mantra or an image. Or sound. And actually that, if you're in a place that's a little noisy, sound can be quite a good anchor, because it makes the sound into the object of your meditation rather than a distraction. So I'll use the word breath, but, and as I say, for most people, most of the time, I think the breath is a really useful object for attention. But be really, be your own guide about this. So I think that's all I want to say about calm. You've probably heard most of it before, but I just wanted to really introduce it as the first kind of aspect of meditation. And then later in the day, we'll talk about how calmness is also supported by insight, by loving kindness. There's a deeper kind of calm that we can also cultivate. But really the foundation of that is some relaxation of the body-mind.